Rain slammed against the frosted glass of the Brass Griffin, Boston's most pretentious culinary trap. Charlotte Henderson, scrubbing a sticky mahogany table, looked like just another exhausted waitress trapped in the brutal service industry. She watched as a shivering, soaking wet elderly man was aggressively shoved toward the door by her tyrannical manager. Without hesitating, she intervened, bought the freezing man a hot meal, and was instantly fired for her insubordination. But her arrogant boss made two catastrophic miscalculations. First, he didn't realize the ragged stranger was sitting on an ocean of sudden wealth. Second, he had absolutely no idea that his lowly waitress was actually the billionaire CEO of the restaurant's parent conglomerate, executing a covert audit. By sunrise, the tables wouldn't just be turned, they would be completely destroyed. The Brass Griffin was supposed to be the crown jewel of Apex Hospitality Group, located in the affluent heart of Boston. It boasted a menu where a simple truffle risotto cost more than a minimum wage worker made in a week. Yet, for the past 3 quarters, profits had been violently bleeding out, and the online reviews painted a grim picture of a toxic environment and plummeting standards. Sitting in her glass-walled penthouse office, 50 stories above the city, Charlotte Henderson had grown tired of reading sanitized reports from her regional directors. At 32, Charlotte had transformed Apex Hospitality from a struggling domestic chain into a global billionaire-dollar empire. She was ruthless in the boardroom, but deeply, fiercely protective of the foundational values her late father had instilled in her hospitality, meant taking care of people. It was a simple ethos that the Brass Griffin seemed to have entirely forgotten. Instead of sending another corporate auditor in a suit, Charlotte fabricated a background check, created a fake social security profile, and hired herself as Charlotte Smith, a waitress desperate for the evening shift. For 2 weeks, she endured the physical agony of the floor. Her feet ached, her hands were calloused from hauling heavy trays of ceramic plates, and her patience was stretched to its absolute limit. But the physical labor was nothing compared to the emotional toll of working under the franchise manager, Rick Smith. Rick was a man whose arrogance was outmatched only by his sheer incompetence. He wore heavily perfumed cologne, sported a slicked-back hairstyle that screamed of mid-level management desperation, and treated his staff like indentured servants. He regularly skimmed the tip pool to cover his own inventory mistakes, berated the kitchen staff until they walked out mid-shift, and openly mocked customers who didn't order the most expensive bottles of wine. Charlotte documented every single infraction. She had a hidden camera in her uniform button and a microscopic audio recorder tucked into her apron. She was building a flawless, airtight case to not only terminate Rick's franchise agreement, but to personally ensure he never worked in the hospitality industry again. It was a torrential Friday night when the breaking point finally arrived. The restaurant was packed with local socialites and arrogant investment bankers. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted duck. Outside, a freak nor'easter had plunged the city into a freezing, miserable deluge. Charlotte was balancing 3 plates of pan-seared scallops when she saw him. The heavy oak doors of the restaurant creaked open, letting in a bitter blast of wind. Standing in the foyer was an older man. His clothes were drenched, clinging to his frail frame. He wore a faded, oversized tweed coat that had seen better decades, and his shoes were scuffed, waterlogged boots. His silver hair was plastered to his forehead, and his hands trembled violently from the biting cold. He didn't look like a beggar, but he clearly looked like a man who had lost a battle with the elements and was desperate for a brief sanctuary. He took a hesitant step onto the pristine, imported Italian marble floor, leaving a small puddle of rainwater in his wake. "Excuse me," the old man rasped, his voice barely audible over the clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy chatter. "Could I just wait here for a moment, just until the rain lets up? I've lost my keys and my phone in the storm." Before the hostess could even respond, Rick Smith materialized from the dining room like a shark smelling blood in the water. His face twisted into a mask of utter disgust as he looked the old man up and down. "Absolutely not," Rick hissed, his voice dripping with venom. He stepped into the old man's personal space, intentionally trying to intimidate him. "This is a 5-star establishment, not a homeless shelter. Look at the mud you're tracking onto my floor. You are disturbing my guests. Get out. Now. Please," the old man said, his teeth chattering. "I have nowhere to go. Just 15 minutes by the radiator. I'm freezing to the bone." "I don't care if you're freezing to death," Rick snapped, his voice rising, drawing the attention of several nearby tables. Some of the wealthy patrons scoffed, turning their noses up at the wet man. "You are an eyesore. You are bad for business. If you don't leave this instant, I will have the police drag you out for trespassing." Charlotte froze. The plates of scallops in her hands suddenly felt weightless as a cold fury ignited in her chest. She had seen Rick be cruel, but this was a profound lack of basic human decency. This was the exact antithesis of everything Apex Hospitality stood for. She quickly set the plates down at her assigned table, ignoring the confused look of the diners, and marched straight toward the foyer. "Rick, stop!" Charlotte said, her voice cutting through the tension. It lacked the subservient tremor a waitress was supposed to have. It was the firm, authoritative voice of a CEO. Rick whipped his head around, his eyes narrowing at her. "Excuse me, Charlotte, are you speaking to me? Get back to your section immediately." "He's freezing," Charlotte said, stepping between Rick and the old man. She looked at the stranger, seeing the deep lines of exhaustion and cold in his face. "Sir, come with me. You can sit at my station in the back booth." The old man looked at her with wide, grateful eyes. I don't have any money on me. Miss, I lost my wallet in the dark when I dropped my keys." "You don't need any money," Charlotte said softly, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. "Your meal is on me tonight." The dining room went completely silent. The only sound was the jazz music playing softly from the overhead speakers and the violent rain lashing against the windows. Rick Smith's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight, starched collar. To be undermined by a waitress in front of his elite clientele was, to his fragile ego, an unforgivable crime. "Have you lost your absolute mind?" Rick whispered harshly, stepping closer to Charlotte so the patrons couldn't hear his profanity, though his body language screamed aggression. "You do not seat vagrants in my restaurant. You do not offer free food to street trash. You will throw him out right now, or you will pack your bags." Charlotte held her ground. She was a woman who regularly negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with the most ruthless corporate raiders on Wall Street. A pathetic, middle-management bully like Rick was nothing but a minor annoyance. He is a human being. "Rick," Charlotte replied, her tone icy and unwavering. "And he needs help. I am taking my designated employee meal break right now, and I am choosing to give my meal to him. I am also paying for a bowl of our lobster bisque out of my own pocket. Here." Charlotte reached into her apron and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, a prop she kept for emergencies, and slapped it hard onto the hostess stand. "That covers the soup and the mud on the floor. Now, I am seating my guest." Without waiting for his response, she gently placed a hand on the old man's damp shoulder and guided him away from the foyer. She led him to a secluded booth near the kitchen, away from the glaring eyes of the snobbish diners, and right next to a large heating vent. She quickly fetched a stack of dry, warm towels from the kitchen, ignoring the panicked whispers of the kitchen staff who knew a storm was brewing with the manager. She handed the towels to the man, poured him a large glass of hot water with lemon, and brought out a steaming, fragrant bowl of the restaurant's signature lobster bisque, paired with freshly baked artisan bread. "Thank you," the man whispered, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the spoon. He wrapped the warm towel around his neck, the color slowly returning to his pale cheeks. "You didn't have to do this. You're going to get into terrible trouble because of me, your boss." He looked furious. "Don't you worry about him." Charlotte smiled, sitting across from him for a brief moment. "He's just a man who forgot that the restaurant business is about hospitality, not just profits. I'm Charlotte. By the way, Anthony," the man replied, finally taking a sip of the rich, warm soup. A look of pure relief washed over his face. "Anthony Peterson, I won't forget this. Charlotte, people usually look right through me when I'm dressed like this. I was doing some late-night gardening at my estate, got locked out, and walked 3 miles in the rain trying to find a locksmith. You are a very rare soul." Before Charlotte could ask what kind of estate he was talking about, the heavy doors of the kitchen swung open with a violent crash. Rick marched toward the booth, flanked by 2 burly security guards he had pulled from the back alley entrance. He was practically vibrating with rage. He had completely abandoned any pretense of professionalism. "Get up!" Rick barked, pointing a trembling finger at Anthony. "Both of you out!" "Rick, I paid for his meal," Charlotte stated calmly, standing up to shield Anthony. "I don't care if you paid in solid gold." Rick screamed, spittle flying from his lips. The entire restaurant was watching now, forks suspended in midair. "You are insubordinate, disrespectful, and utterly worthless. You think you can make the rules in my restaurant? You are nothing. You are a dime-a-dozen plate carrier, and you are officially fired." He reached out, grabbed the collar of Charlotte's apron, and yanked it hard, tearing the fabric. "Take off the uniform, get your trash out of the lockers, and get out of my sight. And take this pathetic old beggar with you before I have you both arrested for trespassing." Anthony quickly stood up, leaving the half-eaten soup. "Please, don't fire her. I'll leave. It's my fault. It's too late for that, old man," Rick sneered, crossing his arms. "She's done." Charlotte slowly untied the torn apron. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Instead, a chilling, terrifyingly calm smirk played at the corner of her lips. She neatly folded the apron and placed it on the table. She looked Rick dead in the eyes, her gaze piercing right through his arrogant facade. "You are making a very large mistake." "Rick," Charlotte said, her voice dropping an octave, resonating with a quiet, dangerous power. "You have no idea who you just fired, or what you just threw away." "I threw away the garbage," Rick laughed mockingly. "Good riddance." Charlotte turned to Anthony. "Come on. Anthony, I'll drive you home. I have a car parked out back." She escorted the elderly man out through the front doors, leaving Rick to bask in his twisted sense of victory, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own professional death warrant. As Charlotte started her sleek, inconspicuous sedan and drove Anthony toward the address he provided. She tapped a button on her steering wheel. "Connect me to legal," she commanded her car's Bluetooth system. "Connecting," the AI replied. Charlotte glanced at the rearview mirror. Tomorrow, the brass griffin was going to experience an earthquake. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving Boston bathed in crisp, golden sunlight. Anthony Peterson didn't wake up in a cardboard box or a city shelter. He woke up in the master suite of a sprawling, 30-acre historic estate in Brookline. Anthony was not a homeless vagrant. He was a wildly eccentric, fiercely private retired hedge fund pioneer who had spent the last 40 years quietly amassing a fortune that rivaled small nations. He despised the trappings of wealth, preferring to spend his days tending to his massive rose gardens in ratty old clothes. But today, Anthony was not gardening. He stood in his walk-in closet, bypassing the comfortable flannels, and selected a bespoke, charcoal grey Savile Row suit that he hadn't worn in a decade. He paired it with a pristine white shirt, a silk tie, and a pair of polished Oxfords. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, his blue eyes sharp and utterly merciless. He walked down the grand staircase of his mansion, where his personal wealth manager, Jacob, was already waiting with a leather briefcase and a cup of black coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," Jacob said, noting the suit with a raised eyebrow. "We have an aggressive agenda today." "Very," Anthony said, taking a sip of the coffee. "Jacob, I need you to look up the franchise ownership of a restaurant downtown called the Brass Griffin. Specifically, I want to know who holds the debt for the lease and the operating licenses." Jacob opened his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. It took him less than 3 minutes to access the financial registries. The franchise rights and the commercial lease are held by an LLC owned by a man named Rick Smith. And, oh my, he is incredibly over-leveraged. He took out massive loans to cover operational losses over the last 2 years. He's currently 60 days delinquent on his primary commercial note with First Republic. Anthony smiled. It was a predatory smile. "Perfect. Call First Republic. Tell them Peterson Capital is buying Rick Smith's debt portfolio in its entirety. Offer them a 10% premium on the principal for an immediate, expedited transfer. Cash." Jacob's eyes widened. "Sir, that will cost millions. Are we foreclosing?" "We are executing a hostile takeover of the franchise rights," Anthony corrected, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "I want to own that restaurant by lunchtime. Then, I want you to draw up transfer papers. The new owner of that restaurant will be a young woman named Charlotte. She was a waitress there. Find her last name and put it in the documents." While Anthony's financial team went to war with the banks, deploying an overwhelming amount of liquid capital to force the immediate sale of Rick's defaulted loans, Charlotte Henderson was sitting in her glass penthouse. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, white designer pantsuit. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing the termination documents for Rick Smith. She had already drafted the paperwork to revoke his franchise license based on a breach of moral turpitude and financial mismanagement. Using the audio recordings from last night as the final nail in the coffin. "Miss Henderson," her chief operating officer said, bursting into her office without knocking, looking utterly bewildered. "We have a situation with the Boston franchise, the Brass Griffin." Charlotte looked up, a brow raised. "I'm already handling it." "Darian, I'm revoking Smith's license today." "You don't understand," Darian said, placing a tablet on her desk. "Smith doesn't own it anymore. As of 20 minutes ago, his bank forced a sale of his assets due to defaulted loans. A private equity firm called Peterson Capital bought the debt, seized the lease, and officially acquired the franchise rights. Charlotte blinked, taken aback. Peterson Capital, wait. Anthony Peterson. You know him? Darian asked. Because the craziest part is the transfer documents. Peterson Capital didn't buy it to keep it. They instantly transferred the sole ownership of the franchise to a newly formed holding company named Charlotte the Waitress, LLCE. Legal is losing their minds, trying to figure out what is going on. A genuine, shocked laugh escaped Charlotte's lips. The frail, freezing old man she had bought soup for was a corporate titan, and he had just bought her own restaurant for her, thinking she was unemployed and needed a job. The sheer poetry of the situation was staggering. Darian, Charlotte smiled, standing up and grabbing her designer coat. Cancel my morning meetings. I need to go visit my new restaurant. Down at the Brass Griffin. The lunch rush was just beginning to prep. Rick Smith was strutting through the dining room in a new, expensive suit he couldn't afford, barking orders at the exhausted staff. He felt invincible. He had asserted his dominance last night, and the kitchen was quiet and compliant. At exactly 11:30 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Anthony Peterson walked in. The transformation was so absolute that Rick didn't even recognize him at first. Anthony walked with the posture of a king, his bespoke suit radiating power and wealth. Behind him stood two men in dark suits carrying leather briefcases. "Welcome to the Brass Griffin," Rick said smoothly, slipping instantly into his sycophantic customer service persona, smelling the money on the men. "Do you have a reservation, gentlemen?" Anthony stopped in the center of the foyer, looking at the exact spot where he had stood shivering the night before. He turned his cold blue eyes to Rick. "I don't need a reservation. Rick," Anthony said, his voice smooth and commanding. Rick froze. The voice was familiar. He stared at the silver hair, the facial features. The blood slowly drained from Rick's face as the horrifying realization set in. It was the vagrant, the old man he had thrown out into the storm. "You," Rick stammered, taking a step back. "What is this? How did you get in here?" "I walked through the front door of my building," Anthony replied calmly. He snapped his fingers, and one of his lawyers stepped forward, slapping a thick stack of legal documents onto the hostess stand. "As of 10:45 a.m. this morning, your defaulted loans were purchased by my firm," Anthony explained, his voice echoing in the quiet restaurant. The staff had stopped prepping and were peering out from the kitchen, watching in stunned silence. "We called the debt. You couldn't pay. We seized the collateral. I now own the lease to this building, the equipment inside it, and the franchise rights you so poorly managed." Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. This is impossible. You can't just buy a restaurant overnight. When you have enough money, Rick, you can buy anything, Anthony said, stepping closer, towering over the broken manager. "Including karma. You fired a young woman last night for showing me the kindness that you are entirely devoid of. So, I bought this restaurant, and I am giving it to her." Before Rick could formulate a defense, the front doors opened again. Charlotte walked in, but she wasn't wearing a stained apron or carrying a tray. She was flanked by her own corporate security team, radiating the undeniable aura of a billionaire CEO. Anthony turned, a warm smile breaking across his face. "Charlotte, I was hoping I could track you down. I have a bit of a surprise for you." Charlotte walked up to Anthony, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Anthony, you are full of surprises, but I think I might have one for you. Two." She turned her gaze to Rick, who was now sweating profusely, looking between the billionaire investor and the waitress he had fired, his brain completely short-circuiting. "Hello, Rick." Charlotte smiled, a predator playing with its food. "It's time we had our performance review." The opulent foyer of the Brass Griffin felt as though the oxygen had been completely vacuumed from the room. The remaining waitstaff, the hostesses, and the culinary team peering through the porthole windows of the kitchen doors stood entirely paralyzed. Rick Smith's mind frantically tried to piece together the surreal tableau before him. On his left stood the homeless vagrant from the storm, now flanked by high-powered corporate attorneys and exuding the undeniable confidence of old money. On his right stood the waitress he had viciously fired just 12 hours ago, currently draped in a pristine, tailored suit that likely cost more than his car, guarded by an intimidating security detail. "Charlotte," Rick choked out, a nervous, high-pitched laugh escaping his throat. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "What is this? Is this some kind of sick joke? Did you hire these actors to scare me because you're bitter about losing your minimum wage job?" Anthony Peterson chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Actors Rick, you truly possess a breathtaking lack of situational awareness. Jacob, show him the foreclosure execution." Jacob, the sharp-eyed wealth manager, smoothly unlatched his briefcase and extracted a manila folder. He didn't hand it to Rick, he simply held it up, displaying the notarized bank seals and the bold, undeniable header, "Notice of seizure and asset transfer." "This is impossible," Rick stammered, stepping back as if the document were radioactive. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You can't do this. I have a binding contract. Even if you bought my debt, you can't just run an Apex hospitality franchise. You don't have the operational license. Corporate will completely destroy you. They will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. Rick clung to that thought like a life raft. He turned his attention away from Anthony and glared at Charlotte, his panic briefly transforming back into his familiar, comfortable arrogance. "And you?" Rick sneered, taking a step toward Charlotte, though her security detail instantly shifted forward, causing him to freeze. "You think dressing up and playing corporate spy is going to save you when the CEO of Apex finds out that some billionaire hedge fund dinosaur is trying to steal one of her flagship properties? She will obliterate both of you. You have no idea the kind of power Apex wields." Charlotte didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply offered a terrifyingly serene smile that made Rick's blood run completely cold. "You're absolutely right, Rick," Charlotte said, her voice smooth as glass. "Apex Hospitality does wield an immense amount of power, and corporate is notoriously ruthless when it comes to protecting its brand, especially when a rogue franchise manager is caught stealing from the tip pool, falsifying inventory reports, and emotionally abusing his staff." Rick's jaw dropped. How could you possibly know about the tip pool?" "Because I audited the books myself," Charlotte replied, taking a step forward, closing the distance between them. The air around her seemed to crackle with absolute authority. "I listened to the audio recordings of you berating the pastry chef until she cried. I watched the hidden camera footage of you physically shoving a freezing, elderly man back into a winter storm. I documented every single breach of your franchise agreement over the past 2 weeks." She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and withdrew a sleek, matte black business card with the gold-embossed Apex Hospitality crest. She flicked her wrist, tossing it lightly onto the hostess stand, right on top of Anthony's foreclosure documents. "Read it," "Rick," Charlotte commanded. Rick's hands were shaking violently as he picked up the heavy cardstock. His eyes darted across the gold lettering. Charlotte Henderson, Chief Executive Officer, Apex Hospitality Group. The card slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. His knees physically buckled, and he had to lean heavily against the brass railing to keep from collapsing entirely. "You," Rick breathed, the word barely a whisper. "You're the CEO. You're Charlotte Henderson." "And you are unemployed," Charlotte stated, delivering the final, crushing blow. "Mister, Peterson owns the physical building and the equipment due to your catastrophic financial negligence. However, I own the brand. As of this exact second, your franchise license is permanently revoked with cause. You are facing an immediate corporate lawsuit for the stolen employee wages, which my legal team will pursue until you are bankrupt. You have absolutely nothing left here. Please," Rick begged, all his previous bravado evaporating into a pathetic, desperate whine. Tears welled up in the corners of his eyes. "Miss Henderson. Charlotte. Please. I'll change. I'll pay back the staff. I'll apologize to Mr. Peterson. Just give me one more chance. This restaurant is my entire life." "Your life was built on stepping on the necks of the people who worked for you," Charlotte replied coldly, showing zero empathy. "Hospitality is about service. It is about care. You lack the fundamental humanity required to operate under my company's banner." She turned to her COO, Darian, who was standing quietly by the door. "Darian, ensure Mr. Smith vacates the premises immediately. If he attempts to take anything other than his personal coat and his car keys, call the police and press theft charges." "Understood." Darian nodded, signaling the security team. Two massive men in suits flanked Rick. He didn't fight them. He was utterly broken, his spirit crushed under the combined weight of two billionaires executing a flawless, synchronized trap. As Rick was escorted out the front doors of the Brass Griffin, taking one last, tearful look at the empire he had squandered, the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. The restaurant was completely silent. Then, from the kitchen doors, a slow, hesitant clapping began. It was Chef Tommy, a brilliant culinary mind who had suffered under Rick's tyranny for a year. The clapping spread. The waitresses, the busboys, the hostesses, they all began to applaud, tears of sheer relief streaming down their faces. The nightmare was finally over. The applause died down as Charlotte raised a hand, signaling for quiet. She looked at the battered, exhausted staff of the Brass Griffin. These were her people, and she had failed them by letting a monster like Rick slip through the corporate vetting process. "Listen to me, everyone." Charlotte projected her voice so it carried all the way to the dish pit. "I know the last few months have been absolute hell. I know you've been underpaid, overworked, and disrespected. That ends today. The restaurant will be closed for the next 48 hours for a complete structural and management overhaul." A murmur of anxiety rippled through the staff. Closing meant lost wages. Charlotte immediately cut it off. "You will all be paid for the next 2 days as if you worked double shifts. Furthermore, every single employee here is receiving an immediate 25% raise, retroactive for the past 3 months to compensate for the tip theft." The anxiety vanished, replaced by gasps of shock and spontaneous cheers. A young waitress named Sophia, who had lent Charlotte her extra hair ties during the worst shifts, openly wept into her hands. "Chef Tommy," Charlotte called out. The tall man in the stained white coat stepped forward nervously. "Yes, Chef, I mean, Miss Henderson. You are now the interim general manager," Charlotte announced. "You have complete creative control over the menu. Throw out Rick's frozen shortcuts. Go back to sourcing local ingredients. If you need a larger budget, call my direct corporate line. Make this place something we can all be proud of again." As the staff dispersed in a flurry of excited energy to begin cleaning the dining room, Charlotte turned back to Anthony Peterson. The elderly billionaire was leaning against his cane, watching the entire spectacle with an expression of sheer, unadulterated amusement. "Well," Anthony chuckled, shaking his head. "This is certainly embarrassing for me." Charlotte raised an eyebrow, a genuine smile playing on her lips. "Embarrassing, Anthony. You just bought a multi-million-dollar piece of commercial real estate before your morning coffee." "Yes," Anthony sighed dramatically, gesturing to his lawyers. "But I bought it to play the role of the White Knight. I wanted to rescue the poor, destitute waitress who sacrificed her last $100 to feed a freezing old man, only to discover that I just bought a restaurant for the CEO of the parent company, who is currently worth roughly 5 times what I am." He laughed out loud. "I rescued the queen of the chessboard." Charlotte laughed with him, the tension of the morning finally breaking. "It's the thought that counts, Anthony. And honestly, it was the most brilliantly ruthless corporate maneuver I've seen in my entire career. Buying his debt to seize the lease, my legal team was in awe." "I have my moments," Anthony said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He gestured to the back booth, the exact same booth where Charlotte had seated him the night before. "Care to join me for lunch? Miss Henderson, I believe you owe me a bowl of lobster bisque." The last one was rudely interrupted. "It would be my absolute pleasure, Mr. Peterson," Charlotte replied. They sat across from each other in the quiet corner, the chaotic noise of the kitchen reorganization serving as a backdrop. Chef Tommy himself brought out 2 steaming bowls of bisque and a basket of freshly baked artisan bread, bowing slightly before rushing back to his domain. Anthony took a sip of the soup and sighed in contentment. Much better without the threat of imminent arrest. He set his spoon down and looked at Charlotte, his expression turning serious. "So, what happens now I own the brick and mortar? You own the brand. Technically, we are business partners." "Technically," Charlotte agreed, tearing off a piece of bread. "I can have Apex Hospitality buy the physical property from Peterson Capital at a 20% markup. You make a quick, tidy profit for your firm, and I consolidate my assets." Anthony waved his hand dismissively. "I don't need the money. Charlotte, I'm 72 years old, and my only heir is a golden retriever named Barnaby, who already has a trust fund. But I do want to do something meaningful with this." Charlotte leaned forward, her corporate instincts merging perfectly with her philanthropic heart. "What are you proposing?" "When I was walking in the rain last night," Anthony began softly, "I realized how invisible you become when people think you have nothing. Rick looked right through me. He saw dirt. But you saw a human being. I want to institutionalize that kindness." He pulled out a pen from his suit pocket and grabbed a napkin. "I will transfer the deed of this property entirely to Apex Hospitality Group, free of charge." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "Anthony, that's a $5 million property." "On one condition," Anthony continued, ignoring her protest. He began sketching a rough flow chart on the napkin. "We established the Peterson-Henderson Initiative, a joint charitable foundation. You have over 200 5-star restaurants globally under the Apex umbrella. The amount of perfectly good, high-end food waste generated by your kitchens every night must be staggering. Charlotte nodded slowly. Seeing where he was going, It's a logistical nightmare to donate it due to liability laws. But we try. We cut through the red tape, Anthony said firmly. I will personally fund a fleet of refrigerated logistics vehicles and a team of specialized corporate lawyers. We take the surplus from every single Apex kitchen, the untouched steaks, the fresh vegetables, the artisan breads, and we distribute it nightly to local shelters and community centers. No more feeding the vulnerable scraps. We feed them dignity. Charlotte looked at the napkin, then back at the brilliant, eccentric man sitting across from her. Her heart swelled. This was exactly the kind of legacy her father had always dreamed of building before he passed away. You want to turn my luxury restaurant empire into a global supply chain for the homeless, Charlotte said, a massive smile breaking across her face. I want to ensure that no one ever gets thrown out into the rain again, Anthony corrected gently. Do we have a deal? CEO. Charlotte reached across the table, firmly grasping Anthony's hand. We have a deal. Partner, she said. But as they shook hands, solidifying a pact that would change the global hospitality industry forever, neither of them realized that Rick Smith wasn't entirely finished. As he sat in his car in the rain-soaked alleyway behind the restaurant, his life in ruins, he made a frantic, desperate phone call to a rival private equity firm, a firm that had been trying to hostilely take over Apex Hospitality for years. The battle for the brass griffin was over, but the war for Charlotte's empire was just beginning. Rain continued to batter the windshield of Rick Smith's leased Mercedes. He sat in the dark, cramped alleyway behind the brass griffin, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were stark white. The humiliation burned in his chest like battery acid. He had been stripped of his livelihood, his reputation, and his pride in less than 24 hours by a waitress and a vagrant who turned out to be corporate leviathans. But Rick was a survivor of the most parasitic variety. During his 2 years mismanaging the Boston franchise, he hadn't just been skimming from the tip pool. He had been quietly mapping the internal vulnerabilities of Apex Hospitality Group. He knew which regional managers were disgruntled, which supply chain contracts were heavily over-leveraged, and most importantly, he possessed a downloaded copy of the master franchise lease agreements, a highly classified corporate document he had illegally forwarded to his personal offshore server weeks ago as an insurance policy. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his phone and dialed a private Manhattan number. The man who answered was Nathaniel Strickland, the ruthless CEO of Strickland Global, a multi-billion-dollar predatory equity firm. Strickland Global was notorious on Wall Street for engineering hostile takeovers. They would find a slightly wounded company, heavily short their stock, launch a devastating public relations smear campaign to tank the valuation, and then buy the controlling shares for pennies on the dollar, liquidating the company's assets for massive profits. They had been circling Apex Hospitality for 3 years, but Charlotte Henderson's flawless leadership had kept their defenses impenetrable. Until now. "Who is this?" Nathaniel Strickland's voice barked through the phone, sharp and impatient. "Mr. Strickland, my name is Rick Smith. Until an hour ago, I was one of the highest-grossing franchise operators for Apex Hospitality." Rick lied smoothly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I have something you want. I have the entire internal blueprint of Apex's domestic lease vulnerabilities. And I have a story that is going to absolutely destroy Charlotte Henderson's reputation with her board of directors." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The sound of a silver lighter flicking echoed through the speaker. "I'm listening," Strickland said. "Henderson has lost her mind." Rick spat venomously. "She spent the last 2 weeks playing dress-up as a waitress in my restaurant instead of running her company. This morning, she illegally revoked my franchise license without due process to give the restaurant away to an elderly vagrant she met on the street. She is using shareholder capital to fund a chaotic, emotional crusade. If you hit her stock now, while she's distracted with this philanthropic fever dream, the board of directors will panic. I will give you the lease data, and you give me a seat on the new executive board when you oust her." A low, predatory chuckle rumbled from Nathaniel Strickland. "Send me the files. Rick, if what you're saying is true, we launch the offensive at the opening bell on Monday." Over the weekend, while Charlotte and Anthony were busy finalizing the logistics for the Peterson-Henderson initiative, drafting contracts for the refrigerated trucks, and securing the legal permits for food distribution, a massive, invisible financial guillotine was being hoisted above their heads. At 9:30 a.m. on Monday, the New York Stock Exchange opened. Within 45 minutes, all hell broke loose. Strickland Global initiated a catastrophic short-selling campaign against Apex Hospitality. Millions of borrowed shares were suddenly dumped onto the open market, creating an artificial panic. Simultaneously, a highly coordinated media blitz hit the financial news networks. Anonymous internal sources leaked highly embellished stories to the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg. The headlines were damning. Apex CEO abandons boardroom to play Waitress. Billion-dollar restaurant group handed over to unvetted outsiders, and is Charlotte Henderson having a public mental breakdown. By noon, Apex Hospitality's stock had plummeted by a staggering 19%. Charlotte was standing in the newly renovated kitchen of the Brass Griffin, tasting Chef Tommy's spectacular new truffle-infused mushroom risotto, when her phone erupted. It was Darian, her COO, sounding entirely out of breath. "Charlotte, you need to get back to the corporate tower immediately," Darian urged, his voice tight with panic. "The stock is in freefall. Strickland Global has filed a public notice of a hostile proxy fight, claiming zero confidence in your leadership. And worse, the board of directors has called an emergency vote of no confidence. They want you to step down as CEO by 5 p.m. today, or they are going to publicly terminate you to stop the bleeding." Charlotte's expression turned to ice. She set the tasting spoon down. Who leaked the internal franchise data to Strickland? He couldn't have executed a short attack this precise without inside information. "Cybersecurity just flagged it," Darian replied grimly. "It was Rick Smith. He downloaded the master files onto a private server 3 weeks ago. We're looking at corporate espionage." "Assemble the board," Charlotte commanded, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I will be there in 20 minutes. She hung up the phone and turned to find Anthony Peterson leaning against the stainless steel prep counter, holding a cup of espresso. He had heard the entire conversation. "Trouble in paradise, partner?" Anthony asked, a dangerous glint in his sharp blue eyes. "A hostile takeover attempt." Charlotte sighed, grabbing her blazer. "A vulture capital firm is using my actions here to convince my board that I'm mentally unfit to lead. They are tanking my stock to buy a controlling interest." Anthony took a slow sip of his espresso. For 40 years, he had been the apex predator of the hedge fund world. He had invented the very tactics that men like Nathaniel Strickland were now trying to use. The old man smiled a cold, terrifying smile that had once made entire international markets tremble. "Charlotte," Anthony said softly. "Do you mind if I tag along to this board meeting? I haven't been in a proper financial bloodbath in a decade, and my joints are feeling a bit stiff. I think a good old-fashioned corporate execution might be exactly what the doctor ordered." The Apex Hospitality boardroom was a cavernous space of glass and black marble, overlooking the Boston skyline. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly tense. The 12 members of the board sat around the massive table, their faces pale, watching the red lines plummet on the Bloomberg terminal projected on the far wall. Sitting at the opposite end of the table was Nathaniel Strickland, flanked by his lawyers, looking like a wolf entirely satisfied with his hunt. He had been invited by the panicked board to present his buyout offer. In the corner, looking incredibly smug in a brand new suit, sat Rick Smith. The heavy glass doors swung open, and Charlotte Henderson walked in, her heels clicking authoritatively against the marble floor. But she didn't walk in alone. Flanking her was an elderly man in a bespoke charcoal suit, leaning on a silver-handled cane. "Miss Henderson," the chairman of the board said nervously, "we asked you to come alone. The board is preparing to vote on your immediate resignation. Mr. Strickland has offered to acquire our outstanding debt and stabilize the stock, provided we install new management. This is a closed-door executive session. Charlotte," Nathaniel Strickland sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. "Who is the dinosaur?" Anthony Peterson ignored Strickland entirely. He walked slowly to the head of the table, his presence commanding absolute silence. He looked at the chairman, then at the projected stock chart. "My name is Anthony Peterson," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The color instantly drained from the chairman's face. Nathaniel Strickland sat bolt upright, his smug expression shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Every person in the financial sector knew the legend of Peterson Capital. He was the ghost of Wall Street, a man with practically infinite liquidity and a reputation for completely annihilating anyone who crossed him. "Mr. Peterson," Strickland stammered, completely losing his composure. What are you doing here?" "I am attending a meeting regarding my personal investments," Anthony replied smoothly, pulling a thick stack of documents from his jacket and dropping them heavily onto the mahogany table. "You see, Mr. Strickland, when you decided to aggressively short-sell Apex stock this morning to drive the price down, you relied on the assumption that retail investors would panic and sell, providing you with cheap shares to cover your borrowed positions." Anthony leaned heavily on his cane, his piercing blue eyes locking on to Strickland. "But they didn't sell to you. They sold to me." The room went deathly quiet. "While you were busy leaking petty rumors to the press," Anthony continued, "I spent the last 3 hours deploying $6 billion of liquid capital through various shell companies. I have aggressively purchased every single available share of Apex Hospitality that you shorted. I now own 34% of this company, making me the largest individual shareholder. Miss Henderson owns 30%. Together, we hold an absolute, unshakable majority." Strickland's hands began to shake. He realized instantly what was happening. It was a financial death sentence. No. You can't have." A short squeeze, Charlotte finished for him, her voice ringing with triumphant authority. "You borrowed millions of shares you don't own, hoping the price would drop. But Anthony bought them all, which means, Nathaniel, when your margin calls come due at the end of the day, you have to buy those shares back from us. And we are not selling. The price of Apex stock is about to violently skyrocket, and your firm is going to have to liquidate every single asset it holds just to cover the legal penalty. By tomorrow morning, Strickland Global will be bankrupt." Strickland collapsed back into his chair, gasping for air as if he had been physically struck. He looked at Rick Smith, his eyes bulging with rage. "You idiot! You told me she was weak! You told me she was giving away the company!" Rick tried to shrink into the corner. His smugness completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, terrifying realization that he had just inadvertently picked a fight with a financial god. "As for you—" "Rick," Charlotte said, stepping toward him. She didn't look angry. She looked utterly indifferent, which was far worse. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice a massive data breach of my master lease files?" The boardroom doors opened again. 2 federal agents from the FBI's Cybercrimes Division walked in, flashing their badges. "Rick Smith," one of the agents said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for felony violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, corporate espionage, and illegal distribution of proprietary trade secrets. Stand up." "Wait, please," Rick begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob as the agents grabbed his arms and forcefully secured his wrists behind his back. "Miss Henderson, Charlotte, I was just angry. I didn't mean it. Please don't let them take me to prison. Hospitality is about taking care of people." "Rick," Charlotte said softly as he was dragged toward the door. "But business is about protecting them. Have a safe trip." As the heavy glass doors closed behind the sobbing, ruined manager, Anthony turned to the stunned, silent board of directors. "Now," Anthony said cheerfully, tapping his cane on the marble floor, "Miss Henderson and I have a charity initiative to launch. I suggest the rest of you gentlemen sit back, relax, and enjoy the massive profits you're about to make when the market realizes we just absorbed Strickland Global's entire portfolio." Meeting adjourned. 3 weeks later. The Boston night was cold, but the rain had stayed away. Outside a crowded community center in the city's south end, a massive, gleaming refrigerated truck was parked under the streetlights. Emblazoned on the side, in elegant gold lettering, was the Peterson-Henderson Initiative. A line of people, many of whom had spent years feeling invisible, stood holding warm, ceramic bowls. Sophia, the waitress who had once wept tears of joy at getting a raise, was carefully ladling steaming, world-class lobster bisque into their bowls, while Chef Tommy handed out fresh, warm artisan bread, treating every single person in line with the exact same reverence and respect he would give a billionaire. Standing by the cab of the truck, sipping hot coffee from paper cups, Charlotte Henderson and Anthony Peterson watched the operation unfold. The stock market was up. Strickland Global was a cautionary tale in the history books, and Rick Smith was awaiting trial in a federal holding cell. "You know," Anthony smiled, looking at the smiles on the faces of the people eating the warm food, "this is a significantly better return on investment than a hostile takeover." "It really is," Charlotte agreed, resting her head gently on the old man's shoulder. "Thank you, Anthony, for everything." "Don't thank me, Charlotte," Anthony chuckled softly. "All I did was ask a stranger if I could get out of the rain. You were the one who opened the door. The story of Charlotte and Anthony proves a timeless reality. Kindness is never a weakness, and arrogance is always a fatal liability." Rick Smith believed that power was defined by how fiercely he could punch down, completely failing to realize that true authority is measured by how quickly you are willing to lift others up. When you operate with genuine compassion, You never know when the freezing stranger at your door might just hold the keys to your entire future. If this story about karma, corporate justice, and the unstoppable power of human decency resonated with you, please hit that like button. It helps push these stories to more people who might need a reminder that good still wins. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next real-life drama. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Charlotte's shoes? Let's talk about it.